My husband divorced me at 78, taking our $4.5 million house. You'll never see the kids again, he laughed in court. I left. But a month later, an unknown number called me. Ma'am, your husband was found dead. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I managed to stay married for 52 years. I used to laugh and say it was stubbornness and good coffee. The truth was simpler than that. I loved Harold. I loved the way he folded his newspaper in thirds before reading it. I loved how he called our golden retriever the Senator, because the dog had a way of walking into a room like he owned it. I loved the house on Birchwood Lane in Connecticut. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, the old maple tree Harold planted the year our son was born. We had built something real. Or so I believed. My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell. I was 76 years old when the ground beneath my feet began to shift. Harold was 78. We had 3 children, our son Douglas, who lived in Phoenix with his wife Renee, and our 2 daughters, Patricia and Susan, both in the Boston area. 6 grandchildren between them. Every Thanksgiving, the house smelled like cornbread and cinnamon. That was the life I knew. That was the life I thought was permanent. The first sign came on a Tuesday in late October. I remember because the leaves had just peaked. That particular orange and gold Connecticut does better than anywhere on earth. I had gone to the pharmacy to pick up Harold's blood pressure medication and mine, and the pharmacist told me Harold had called ahead to change the billing address on his account. Not ours. His. A post office box in Westport I had never heard of. I told myself it was a mistake. Harold was forgetful. He was 78. These things happen. But then I noticed he had started closing his laptop when I entered the room. Harold, who had spent 30 years as a civil engineer and claimed he would never understand computers, was suddenly protective of a screen. He took phone calls in the garage. He began driving to the hardware store on Saturday mornings and returning 2 hours later without a single bag. Once, I smelled perfume on his jacket collar. Something young and synthetic. Nothing I recognized. I did not confront him immediately. I am not, by nature, a dramatic woman. I watched. I listened. I told myself there were explanations. We had been through difficult seasons before. The year Douglas nearly lost his business. The year I had a cancer scare that turned out to be nothing. We had always come through. But one evening in December, I found a card in his coat pocket while I was taking it to the dry cleaner. It was a Christmas card, unsigned, but the handwriting was feminine and careful. It said, "Every day with you is a gift. K." I stood in the hallway of the house on Birchwood Lane, the house Harold and I had bought in 1987, the house where I had raised 3 children and buried 2 dogs and grown a garden that was written up once in the local paper. And I felt something cold pass through me. K. Just a letter. But a letter is enough to end a world. I said nothing that night, or the next. I cooked dinner. I watched the evening news beside him on the sofa. I smiled when he made jokes, and all the while I was memorizing his behavior, the way you memorize a map when you know you are going to need it. By February, I had confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Harold was seeing a woman named Karen Whitfield. She was 54 years old, 24 years younger than him, a real estate consultant from Westport. I found her name through a receipt I discovered in the recycling bin from a restaurant in Greenwich neither Harold nor I had ever been to together. When I tried to speak to him about it quietly one Sunday morning, he did not deny it. He looked at me across the breakfast table, the same table where we had eaten thousands of meals, And he said, with a calm I had never heard from him before, "Margaret, I want a divorce. My attorney will be in touch." That was all. No explanation, no apology, no grief on his face. 52 years, and he said it the way you'd cancel a magazine subscription. What followed was 6 months of legal proceedings I was wholly unprepared for. Harold had retained a team of attorneys, not one, but 3, specializing in asset protection. I later learned he had begun restructuring our finances 18 months before he filed. The house on Birchwood Lane, valued at $4.5 million by that point, had been quietly transferred into an LLC he had formed without my knowledge. Our joint savings had been reduced to a figure that barely covered 2 years of modest living. I hired an attorney of my own, a kind but underpowered man named Gerald Marsh, who had handled mostly wills and minor estate work. He did his best. It wasn't enough. The day of the final hearing, Harold sat across the courtroom looking healthy and calm, Karen Whitfield waiting in the hallway outside. When the judge finalized the settlement, giving Harold the house and leaving me with a fraction of what I was owed, Harold turned to look at me, and he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was quiet and satisfied, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "You'll never see the kids again," he said, low enough that only I could hear. "I've made sure of that." I did not cry. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at him. This man I had loved for over half a century. And I memorized his face the same way I had memorized everything else. Then I left Connecticut. I drove to my sister Ruth's house in Vermont. It took 3 hours and 20 minutes, and I cried for the first hour and was numb for the rest. Ruth was 71, widowed, and she lived in a small farmhouse outside Montpelier that smelled like wood smoke and dried lavender. She opened the door before I even knocked. She always knew when I was coming, the way older sisters do. I stayed in her guest room for 3 weeks. I slept badly. I ate toast and soup and let Ruth's 2 cats sleep on my feet, which helped more than I expected. I made lists. That was always how I processed things. I made lists. On a yellow legal pad I found in Ruth's kitchen drawer, I wrote down everything I had lost. The house, first. Birchwood Lane, the wraparound porch, the maple tree. Then the money. Our joint savings account had been drained legally through Harold's restructuring, and my share of the settlement came to $310,000 after attorney fees. That sounds like a sum until you are 76 years old with no income, no property, and the medical expenses that come with age. Then I wrote down the children. Douglas had called me once after the hearing. He said, "Mom, Dad explained everything. I think you need to give him space." He hung up before I could respond. Patricia had not called at all. Susan sent a text message that said she was staying out of it. These were my children. I had sat with every one of their fevers. I had driven them to soccer practice and SAT tutoring and emergency rooms. I had loved them without condition for decades, and they were staying out of it. I wrote their names on the list, too. Not out of bitterness, not yet, just to acknowledge what was real. For the first 2 weeks, I told myself I simply needed to survive. Find a place to live. Figure out the money. Breathe. Ruth offered to let me stay as long as I needed, and I was grateful, but I also knew that Ruth's house was Ruth's life, and I was not a woman who survived by borrowing someone else's space indefinitely. But somewhere in the 3rd week, while I was sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with my legal pad and a cup of tea gone cold, something shifted. I had been so focused on what had been done to me that I hadn't stopped to ask a different question. What had been done exactly, and was it legal? I am not a lawyer. I never finished my degree. I left college in 1969 to marry Harold. which was what women did then, a decision I made freely and never fully regretted until now. But I was not unintelligent. I had managed our household finances for decades. I had balanced budgets and negotiated with contractors, and once, when Harold was hospitalized for a week, I had managed his small engineering firm's payroll myself without a single error. I understood documents. I understood numbers. And the more I thought about the timeline, the LLC, the account restructuring, the 18 months of preparation Harold had done before filing, the more I thought, Gerald Marsh never looked closely enough. I called Gerald from Ruth's kitchen. He was polite and sympathetic and confirmed that he had reviewed Harold's financial disclosures as filed. I asked him one question. Had he independently verified that the asset transfers to the LLC preceded Harold's intention to divorce, or had they happened after the decision was made? Because if Harold had transferred marital assets after deciding to seek divorce but before filing, that could constitute fraudulent transfer of marital property. There was a long pause on the line. "Mrs. Caldwell," Gerald said, "that's a very specific question." "I know," I said. "Can you answer it?" He could not. He had not looked. That was the moment my plan was born. Not out of anger, though anger was there, steady as a pilot light, but out of something colder and more useful. The recognition that the game had not been played fairly, and that unfairly played games could sometimes be replayed. I needed a different attorney. I needed someone who understood asset concealment and fraudulent conveyance in the context of divorce. I needed financial records I didn't currently have, and I needed, most importantly, to understand what Harold had actually done. Not what he had claimed on his disclosures, but what he had actually done. I opened my laptop, the small one I'd bought myself 3 years ago to video call the grandchildren, and I began to research. I found the name of a firm in Hartford, Brennan and Associates, that specialized in high-asset divorce litigation with a focus on financial misconduct. I found that Connecticut law allowed for post-judgment motions if fraud could be demonstrated in the original proceedings. I found that LLC transfers made within 2 years of a divorce filing could be scrutinized if the intent to defraud could be shown. I wrote all of this down in my yellow legal pad, in my careful, even handwriting. Then I called Brennan and Associates and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I told Ruth that evening over dinner. She set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The same one she'd given me at 17 when I told her I was going to try out for the school play despite being terrified of audiences. "You're going to fight him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to find out the truth first," I said, "and then I'm going to fight him." The drive to Hartford took just over an hour from Ruth's house. I wore my good wool coat, charcoal gray, bought years ago for a faculty dinner Harold had dragged me to, because I believed in showing up to serious meetings as seriously as they deserved. I had my legal pad, a folder of every document from my original divorce proceedings, and the receipt from the Greenwich restaurant I had kept, folded inside my wallet for months. Brennan and Associates occupied the 4th floor of a building near the state capitol. The attorney who met with me was not Mr. Brennan himself, but a woman named Claire Nguyen, mid-40s, efficient, with the kind of stillness that I associated with people who spent their days in rooms where a great deal depended on staying calm. She shook my hand and did not speak to me the way some younger people speak to women my age, with that slight elevation of volume and simplification of vocabulary. She simply asked me to start from the beginning. I did. I talked for almost 90 minutes. She took notes. She did not interrupt except to ask precise, useful questions. Exact dates, dollar amounts, names of entities. When I finished, she sat back and looked at what she had written. "The LLC formation date," she said. "Do you know it?" "I know it was registered in Delaware," I said. "I don't know the exact date." That's the first thing we need, she said. If it was formed after Harold made the decision to divorce, and there are ways to establish that, you have grounds for a fraud claim that could reopen the settlement entirely. What would that require? I asked. A subpoena for his financial records, the LLC's formation documents, and his attorney-client communications to the extent they reveal intent. She paused. This is not a fast process, Mrs. Caldwell, and Harold will fight it. I know, I said. He has resources. So do we, she said simply. I retained Claire Nguyen that afternoon. It cost me $8,000 up front, nearly a third of what I had readily accessible, and I paid it without hesitation. Some expenditures are not expenses. They are decisions. Claire filed the post-judgment motion within the week, citing potential fraudulent conveyance and requesting full discovery of Harold's financial records from the prior 36 months. The motion was accepted by the court, and formal discovery notices were sent to Harold's attorneys. I know the moment Harold found out because Douglas called me. It was a Thursday evening, and I was back at Ruth's house eating leftover chicken soup when my phone rang with Douglas's number. The first time he had called since that single, disappointing call after the hearing. His voice was tight in the way it got when he was performing calm over agitation. Mom, Dad says you've hired new lawyers. He says you're trying to reopen the divorce. I've filed a post-judgment motion, I said. That's accurate. Mom. A breath. This is just going to drag everything out and cost you money you don't have. Douglas, I said, did your father ask you to make this call? Silence, which was its own answer. Tell him I said hello, I said, and I ended the call. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment in Ruth's kitchen and recognized what had just happened. Harold had reached out through our son, a man I had raised, to pressure me into dropping a legal action. He had recruited Douglas as a messenger. The implications of that were not lost on me. The evidence came 6 weeks later, delivered in a thick envelope from Claire's office. The LLC, Birchwood Holdings, LLC, had been incorporated in Delaware on March 14th. Harold's divorce filing had been submitted to the court on September 9th of the same year. That 6-month gap seemed to suggest, on its face, that Harold had planned the transfer well in advance. But the document that mattered most was a series of emails recovered during discovery. Communications between Harold and his lead attorney, a man named Franklin Tate, dating from the previous January. In those emails, Harold had written explicitly, I want to be sure the property is outside the marital estate before I file. Karen says the Westport market is peaking, and I want to move quickly. January, 8 months before he filed. While we were still sleeping in the same house, eating at the same table, watching the evening news side by side on the same sofa. I read that email sitting in Claire's office on a gray February afternoon and felt something crystallize inside me. Not rage. I had moved past rage into something more architectural, a structure of intention that was solid and load-bearing. Is this enough? I asked Claire. She allowed herself a small, controlled smile. It's a very good start, she said. I walked out of that building into the cold Hartford air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. Was this the moment everything changed? In some ways, it already had. Harold had thought he was dealing with a woman who would grieve quietly and disappear. He had miscalculated, the way powerful people often do, by assuming that age and loss had diminished me. They had not. Claire moved quickly after that. She filed a formal motion to vacate the divorce settlement on grounds of fraudulent conveyance, attaching the emails as Exhibit A. She also filed a separate request for a temporary injunction preventing any sale or further transfer of Birchwood Holdings LLC assets while the motion was pending, which meant Harold could not sell the house or move money out of the entity while the case was active. The injunction was granted within 72 hours. I heard nothing from Harold directly. What I heard came in pieces, through channels he had apparently decided were safer for him. The first came from Patricia. She arrived at Ruth's farmhouse on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. A 3-hour drive from Boston, which told me the trip had been planned with some urgency. Patricia was 50 years old, an educator with Harold's high forehead and his habit of pressing her lips together when she was calculating what to say next. She sat across from me at Ruth's kitchen table and folded her hands on the surface, and I thought, she has been coached. "Mom," she said, "Dad's attorneys have told him that if this goes to a full hearing, it could take years. He's 78. The stress alone—" "Patricia," I said, "did your father send you here?" She hesitated one beat too long. "I'm here because I'm worried about both of you. Your father transferred our marital home into a shell company while we were still married," I said, keeping my voice even. "He did it after he had already decided to divorce me and before he filed. There are emails that prove his intent. I'm not pursuing this out of spite. I'm pursuing it because it was fraud." Patricia's expression shifted. A brief flash of something that might have been surprise, or might have been the realization that I knew more than she had expected. "Dad says those emails are being misrepresented. Then his attorneys can explain that in court," I said. She stayed another hour, circling the same points. She never raised her voice. Neither did I. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway, a stiff, obligatory embrace, and I watched her car disappear down Ruth's graveled drive and felt a specific sadness that was different from anger. My daughter had come not to support me, but to manage me. That was who she had become, or perhaps who she had always been when tested. The more aggressive response came 4 days later. Harold's lead attorney, Franklin Tate, sent a letter to Claire threatening a counter-motion alleging that my post-judgment filing was frivolous and constituted harassment, and that they would seek attorneys' fees as sanctions. It was a standard intimidation maneuver, Claire told me, designed to make the cost of continuing feel prohibitive. She responded with a 12-page brief citing case law and the specific statutory basis for our fraud claim. That same week, Douglas called again. This time his approach was different, less dutiful, more pointed. He told me that if I continued the legal action, the family relationship as it stood could not be maintained. He said the grandchildren had been confused and upset. He said Karen Whitfield, and the use of her name was deliberate, I understood, meant to signal that she was now a permanent fixture, had been unfairly maligned, and he hoped I would consider everyone's feelings. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Douglas, I hope you kept a copy of everything your father told you to say, because if this reaches court, the jury will want to understand the full picture of how Harold communicated with his family during these proceedings." The line went very quiet. "I'm not threatening you," I said. "I'm informing you. There's a difference." He didn't call again after that, not for a long time. The court hearing on the injunction was held in mid-March. Harold appeared in person, the first time I had seen him since the original hearing. He looked well, slightly thinner, but well. He sat with Franklin Tate and 2 other attorneys and did not look at me once during the proceeding. The judge reviewed the exhibits, heard arguments from both sides, and maintained the injunction. It was not a final ruling. The full hearing on the fraud motion was scheduled for September. But maintaining the injunction was significant. It meant the court took our case seriously enough to preserve the status quo. When we left the courthouse, Harold passed within 5 feet of me in the corridor. He still didn't look at me. I noticed his hands were clenched. Claire walked me to my car. "They'll try something else before September," she said. "They always do." "Let them," I said. And I meant it. but I was also tired in a way that went deeper than a night's sleep could fix. I drove back to Ruth's house and spent 3 days doing very little. Reading old paperbacks Ruth had stacked in the hallway, walking the field behind her house in the early mornings, letting myself be simply a person who was cold and tired and who had done everything she could for now. I needed those days. The hardest parts were still ahead. The offer came through Claire's office in early April. Harold's attorneys proposed a revised settlement. They would transfer $800,000 to me in exchange for my dropping all litigation and signing a comprehensive release of claims. That was roughly $490,000 more than I had received originally. They framed it as a gesture of goodwill. Claire brought it to me without recommendation, which I respected. She laid the documents on her desk and let me read them in silence. I read carefully. The release language was thorough. It covered not only the current fraud motion, but any potential future claims against Harold personally, against Birchwood Holdings, LLC, and against Karen Whitfield. It included a non-disparagement clause that would have prevented me from discussing the circumstances of my divorce with anyone. It required me to sign within 14 days. I set the papers down. "He's worried," I said. "Yes," Claire said. "If he weren't worried, he'd be offering nothing," I said. Also, yes, I thought about $800,000. I thought about it genuinely. I was not a fool, and I was not so righteous that I would dismiss the practical reality of money when you are 76 years old with no income and mounting legal costs. $800,000 would secure the rest of my life comfortably. It would relieve the anxiety that woke me at 3 in the morning some nights, the quiet arithmetic of how long my savings would last. But the non-disparagement clause, the release that covered Karen Whitfield, those weren't provisions designed to give me a fair outcome. They were provisions designed to seal a fraudulent transaction behind a legal wall so that no one, not now, not ever, could examine what Harold had actually done. And underneath the practical calculation was something I had not expected to feel so clearly. It mattered to me that the truth existed on the record, not just in my memory or Ruth's kitchen or Claire's files, but in a court document, acknowledged, established, real. That mattered. I had spent 52 years being Harold Caldwell's wife, and for the last of those years, I had been managed and deceived and legally outmaneuvered while he smiled across the breakfast table. I wanted the record to say what had happened. I wanted that more than $800,000. "I'm declining," I said. Claire nodded. She did not look surprised. I asked her to send a formal rejection within the hour. What I did not expect in the weeks that followed was how much I needed other people. Not counsel, not strategists, just people who understood, in the marrow of their experience, what it meant to be where I was. Ruth had given me shelter, but Ruth's life was small and quiet, in ways that, over time, began to feel like a kind of soft pressure. She worried about me constantly. She asked how I was sleeping too many times a day. Her care was real, but it was also, quietly, one more form of being managed. It was Claire who mentioned almost offhandedly that there was a support group that met on Wednesday evenings in Hartford. Women over 60 navigating major life transitions, often including late-life divorce. She said she had mentioned it to other clients. She said nothing more about it. I went the following Wednesday. There were 11 women in the group. They ranged in age from 62 to 81. They met in the community room of a library branch near downtown Hartford. Folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, a table with a coffee urn, and a box of cookies that was always the same brand. A facilitator named Donna, who was a retired social worker with a quiet authority, I found immediately reassuring. I was not accustomed to speaking about my life in a group, but I listened first, and what I heard was a kind of testimony. Women who had been dismissed and surprised and diminished, who had rebuilt not through some cinematic surge of strength, but through the slow, often boring work of continuing to show up for themselves. A woman named Bev, who was 73, had left an abusive marriage at 68 and now ran a small dog grooming business. A woman named Harriet, 79, was fighting her late husband's family over an estate they had tried to exclude her from entirely. After the third meeting, Bev walked out with me to the parking lot and said, "You've got that look." "What look?" I asked. "The one where you're still in the thick of it, but you've already decided you're going to come out the other side," she said. "I recognize it. I had it." I drove back to Ruth's house that night and sat in the dark car for a few minutes before going in. Had I already decided? Yes. I supposed I had. And knowing it was written on my face somehow made it more real, like a promise I had made not just to myself, but to the version of myself that those women in that circle could already see. I was not alone. That was the thing I had forgotten. I was not alone. They came on a Sunday in May, Patricia and Douglas together, which told me they had coordinated carefully. They called ahead this time, a courtesy that felt, under the circumstances, more like a warning than a kindness. Ruth offered to stay in the house, but I asked her to take her walk as planned. This was mine to handle. We sat in Ruth's small living room. Patricia brought flowers, yellow tulips, which struck me as a strange choice, cheerful in a way that felt performative. Douglas sat with his arms crossed in the way he had since adolescence, physical armor he was never fully aware of. I made tea. I set out cups. I performed the rituals of hospitality because they steadied me. Patricia spoke first. "Mom, we've been talking a lot, as a family. And we want you to know that whatever happens legally, we love you, and we want to find a way through this together." I let the sentence settle. "That's kind," I said. "Dad is willing to speak with you directly," Douglas said, "without attorneys. He thinks you could reach an agreement that works for everyone, if you were willing to talk to him." Ah, there it was. Harold, unable to come himself, perhaps on legal advice, perhaps simply unwilling to face me, had sent the children to arrange a private negotiation outside the formal proceedings. Anything agreed in such a meeting would exist in a gray zone, pressure applied without witnesses, and would likely be framed afterward, however Harold chose to frame it. "Dad's attorneys made me an offer through my attorney last month," I said. "I declined it through proper channels. If he has a new offer, that's the appropriate route." "Mom." Patricia's voice shifted, shading into something I recognized. The tone she used to manage disagreements in her professional life, level and just slightly condescending. "This level of conflict isn't good for anyone. Dad is 78. The stress of prolonged litigation—" "Patricia," I said, "your father was not concerned about stress when he spent 18 months restructuring our finances before he filed for divorce." She paused. "He says that's not accurate." "There are emails," I said, "dated and authenticated." Something flickered in Douglas's expression. A brief break in the performance that told me he hadn't known about the emails, or hadn't known they were that specific. He glanced at Patricia. Patricia looked at her tulips. "We're asking you to consider the family," Douglas said, and his voice was different now, less managed, more raw. "Susan's kids ask about you. The grandchildren don't understand what's happening." That one landed. He knew it would. I felt it in my chest, the way you feel the cold through a window pane. Present and real and not to be underestimated. I missed my grandchildren with a physical constancy that I had not fully admitted to myself. "Douglas," I said, keeping my voice very steady, "if your father wanted me to have a relationship with my grandchildren, he would not have said in open court that I would never see them again. He made that choice, not me." "He said that out of anger," Patricia said quickly. "He said it while smiling," I said. "No answer to that." I love you both, I said. I want you in my life, but I am not going to drop a legally valid fraud claim because it makes family gatherings easier. That is not a choice I am willing to make. They stayed another 40 minutes. They cycled back through the same appeals: the grandchildren, Harold's age, the cost and exhaustion of litigation, the idea that I might be being influenced by attorneys who had a financial interest in prolonging the case. That last one was clever. It was designed to make me doubt Claire, to introduce a wedge between me and the one professional who was genuinely on my side. I noted it without showing that I'd noted it. When they left, Patricia hugged me in the doorway again, the same stiff embrace as before. Douglas kissed my cheek. Neither of them looked me in the eye on the way out. I watched their car until it disappeared. Then I went inside and sat down in Ruth's armchair and let myself feel what was underneath all the steadiness I had performed for the last 2 hours. It was fear. A real, sizable fear. Not of Harold, not of the lawsuit, but of the possibility that I would win everything legally and lose my children in the process. That the price of being right would be a silence where my family used to be. I sat with that fear for a long time, and then something happened that I had experienced before, in difficult years. The fear began to change into something else. It hardened, the way candied sugar hardens when the temperature drops, into a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its precision. I had not created this situation. I had not deceived anyone, restructured any assets, or recruited my children to deliver strategic messages. I had been acted upon, and I had chosen to respond. The fear was real, but so was everything else. I picked up my phone and called Bev from the support group. She answered on the second ring, and I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. "Good," she said when I finished. "You held." "I held," I said. "That's all it takes," she said. "Every single time." September arrived slowly, and then all at once, the way important things do. Claire and I had spent the preceding months building our case with a thoroughness that I found, unexpectedly, to be its own kind of comfort. Discovery had yielded more than the January emails. It had produced bank transfer records, LLC operating agreement amendments, and communications between Harold and Karen Whitfield that left very little ambiguous. Karen had been involved in advising Harold on the property restructuring from the beginning. She was a real estate consultant, and her fingerprints, professionally speaking, were on the valuation strategy that had been used to minimize the house's accessible marital value. Claire had engaged a forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man named Dr. Richard Cowell, who had prepared a 40-page analysis of Harold's financial activities over the 30 months preceding the divorce filing. The picture it painted was detailed and damning, a systematic, deliberate effort to remove the primary marital asset from the estate before the divorce was filed, undertaken with full knowledge of the legal consequences and with the assistance of professionals who should have advised otherwise. I had read every page of Dr. Cowell's report. I had asked Claire to explain the sections I didn't follow. I walked into that September hearing knowing the case better than I had known almost anything in the preceding 2 years. The courthouse was the same one where the original hearing had been held. I wore the charcoal wool coat again. It was too warm for September, but I wore it anyway. Some decisions aren't about weather. Harold arrived with Franklin Tate and a younger attorney I hadn't seen before, a woman, which I suspected was a strategic choice, designed to soften the optics of what was essentially a case of an elderly man defrauding his elderly wife. He looked older than he had in March. The thinness had progressed. He walked more carefully. He glanced at me when he entered. This time, he did not look away immediately. His expression was controlled, but underneath the control was something I recognized. the calculation of a man who had realized, perhaps recently, that the outcome was no longer certain. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Claire presented the evidence methodically. The timeline, the emails, Dr. Kowal's financial analysis, the LLC formation documents, the parallel communications with Karen Whitfield. Each exhibit was entered calmly, explained clearly, connected to the next. I sat and watched and thought about how different this was from the original proceeding, where Gerald Marsh had done his earnest, insufficient best, and Harold's team had run the table. Franklin Tate's defense was that Harold had formed the LLC for legitimate estate planning purposes unrelated to the divorce, and that the January emails were being taken out of context. He produced a letter from an estate planning attorney, not Harold's divorce attorney, suggesting that the restructuring had been recommended for tax purposes. The judge, the Honorable Andrea Marsh, no relation to Gerald, had been reading as the testimony proceeded. She was in her mid-50s, methodical in the way that bench veterans often are, and she asked questions with the precision of someone who had already identified the relevant inconsistencies. She asked Franklin Tate, if the LLC had been formed for estate planning purposes, why had Harold's communications about it focused on ensuring the property was outside the marital estate prior to filing? Tate answered that this was a misreading of the communication. The judge asked him to clarify what reading he believed was correct. Tate explained. The judge asked a follow-up. Tate answered. The judge's questions became more specific, narrowing toward a corner that Tate was visibly struggling to find a way out of. And then Harold did something I had not anticipated. He leaned over and interrupted his own attorney mid-sentence. It was quiet enough that I might not have caught it from across the room, except the courtroom had gone very still. Tell her it was mine, Harold said, not quietly enough. I built that house. I paid for it. It was mine. The judge heard it. She looked at Harold directly. Mr. Caldwell, she said, your attorney is addressing the court. Harold straightened. Tate touched his arm. A brief, urgent gesture. Harold shook it off with a small, sharp movement. The younger attorney leaned in and whispered something. Harold shook his head. Judge Marsh watched all of this with an expression that revealed nothing and recorded everything. Continue, Mr. Tate, she said. Tate continued, but the rhythm had been broken. He stumbled twice in the following 10 minutes, misreferencing an exhibit number, then catching himself, then referring to an argument he had already made as if it were new. Harold sat beside him with his hands flat on the table, jaw set, and I could see from 30 feet away that he was furious, not at the proceedings, but at the recognition that they were not going the way he had expected them to go. I did not look away. When Claire gave her closing argument, she was measured and clean and left nothing out. She cited the law, the evidence, the specific harm, and the remedy she was seeking, vacatur of the original settlement, and a new division of marital assets that reflected what had actually existed. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the same way I had sat at the original hearing, but I was not the same woman. After the session adjourned, Judge Marsh announced she would issue her written ruling within 30 days. Claire walked me out. Neither of us spoke until we were on the sidewalk. He handed it to us, she said. He always thought he was the only one paying attention, I said. She looked at me for a moment. He was wrong about that. Yes, I said. He was. The ruling came in 22 days. It was a Thursday, and I was at Ruth's kitchen table drinking coffee when Claire called. She had received the written opinion from the court at 8:30 in the morning and had read it through twice before calling me at 9. I will tell you what she told me, in the order she told me. Judge Andrea Marsh had found, by clear and convincing evidence, that Harold Caldwell had engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital property prior to the divorce filing, with intent to deprive Margaret Caldwell of her equitable share of the marital estate. The formation of Birchwood Holdings LLC was found to have been undertaken in bad faith, with full knowledge of its impact on the divorce proceedings. The January emails were cited extensively in the opinion. The original settlement was vacated, the house on Birchwood Lane, and all assets held within Birchwood Holdings, LLC, were ordered returned to the marital estate for proper equitable distribution. Based on Connecticut's equitable distribution standards, Harold was ordered to pay Margaret 60% of the total marital estate, a figure, after accounting for all assets, that came to approximately $3.1 million, including the house or its equivalent cash value, if it were to be sold. Franklin Tate was referred to the Connecticut Bar's Disciplinary Committee for review in connection with his role in the original asset transfer strategy. Karen Whitfield was named as a knowing participant in the fraudulent conveyance scheme and was ordered to provide an accounting of all professional services she had rendered to Harold during the period in question. A separate civil claim against her was possible, Claire noted, if I chose to pursue it. I sat at Ruth's kitchen table with the phone to my ear and looked out the window at the field behind her house, where the light was coming through the trees at the angle it only does in early autumn. "Margaret," Claire said, "did you hear all of that?" "Yes," I said. "I heard every word." I thanked her. I told her she had been extraordinary. She said the evidence had been extraordinary, and that my own preparation had made her job considerably easier. We agreed to speak again the following day to discuss implementation steps. I set the phone down. Ruth was in the doorway. She had heard enough. I stood up and she crossed the kitchen, and we held each other the way sisters do. Not elegantly, just completely. And I felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, the specific relief of a burden that has been set down after being carried for so long you had stopped noticing its weight. We didn't speak for a long moment. There was nothing that needed saying that the silence couldn't hold better. Ruth finally pulled back and looked at me. Really looked, the way she had been doing since we were girls. And her eyes were bright, and her chin was steady, and she said, very quietly, "Mom would have been proud of you." I had to look away after that. Not because it hurt, but because it was too large to receive all at once. I went to the window and stood there for a while, watching the field. The goldenrod was still out, late for September, bending slightly in the wind. The maple at the edge of the property had just begun to turn. I thought about the maple on Birchwood Lane, the one Harold had planted the year Douglas was born, whether anyone would notice when it peaked this year, whether anyone in that house would think to look. And then I let the thought go. Some things you release not because they stop mattering, but because holding them no longer serves you. I made us both a fresh cup of coffee. We sat back down at the table. Ruth put her hand over mine and left it there, and we watched the light move across the field for a long time without saying anything at all. That was a Thursday. On the following Monday, at 9:47 in the morning, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. A 203 area code. "Connecticut," I answered. The man on the line identified himself as a physician at Bridgeport Hospital. He spoke carefully, in the way that hospitals train people to deliver news. Harold had been found at the house on Birchwood Lane by a neighbor who had seen the front door standing open for 2 days. He had suffered a massive cardiac event. He had been alone. He had been transported, but there had been nothing to be done. He was 78 years old. He had died on Saturday morning, the day after the ruling was received by his attorneys. Karen Whitfield had not been there. Douglas had told the hospital that she had left for a trip to the Berkshires the previous week and had not responded to messages. I stood in Ruth's hallway with the phone in my hand after the call ended and stood very still for a long time. What do you feel when the man who wronged you dies? I have thought about this question many times since. The answer is not simple, and I am not going to make it simple for the purposes of this story. I felt grief, real, complicated grief, for the man he had been before he became the man he was at the end. I felt the particular hollowness of anger that has no longer any object to act upon. I felt, underneath both of those things, a sober recognition that the ruling stood. Harold's estate was now subject to the same legal obligations he had been. His death did not erase the judgment. It complicated the implementation, but Claire had assured me, in a follow-up call that afternoon, that the estate proceedings would honor the court's order. I went back to Ruth's kitchen table. I poured a fresh cup of coffee. I sat with all of it, the grief, the relief, the strangeness, and did not try to resolve it into something neater than it was. Some things cannot be made neat. That doesn't mean they cannot be survived. The estate proceedings took 11 months. Harold's death had not simplified things. It rarely does. But it had not undermined them either. His estate was administered by an executor appointed by the probate court, and the executor was legally obligated to honor the judgment against the estate. Birchwood Lane was listed for sale in the spring. It sold in June. $4.7 million, $20,000 above the initial ask. And from the proceeds, my court-ordered share was transferred to my account. $3,100,000. After 11 months of estate proceedings and legal fees, and the kind of patience that you discover you are capable of only when there is no alternative to being capable of it. I was 77 years old. I had, once again, a future. I did not stay in Connecticut. I had made that decision somewhere in the long months of waiting, quietly, without drama. The house was sold. Harold was buried in the cemetery where his parents were buried, and I attended the graveside service, briefly and at a distance, because 52 years required some acknowledgement, and I am not a woman who refuses acknowledgement. I stood at the edge and said goodbye to the man I had married, which was not the same man who had died, and then I got in my car and drove away. I moved to Sarasota, Florida. I had visited once, years before, and remembered the quality of the light, the way it came off the Gulf of Mexico in the evenings, less sharp than New England light, more generous. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in a building near the waterfront while I figured out what I wanted to own. I walked every morning along the bay. I found a library branch where I became a regular. I found a church with a small choir that needed an alto, and I joined it, though I had not sung regularly since my 40s. I found Donna, the support group facilitator, had a colleague in Sarasota who ran a similar group. I became, in time, a member of that circle too. And then, eventually, a volunteer, sitting with women who were in the early, terrible stages of what I had been through, listening the way Bev had listened to me. I made a friend named Louisa, 74, a retired pediatrician originally from Georgia, with a laugh that came from deep and arrived unexpectedly, like weather. We walked together 3 mornings a week and went to the farmers market on Saturdays and argued about books with the cheerful viciousness of people who take literature seriously. It was ordinary. It was sustaining. It was enough. My children and I found a cautious middle ground. Not the warmth I had hoped for, not the estrangement I had feared, but something workable and honest. Douglas called once a month. Patricia and I exchanged emails. Susan, who had stayed furthest from all of it, eventually called to apologize. Not for anything specific, which was its own kind of statement, but an apology nonetheless. I accepted it. The grandchildren began to reappear gradually. A video call here, a visit there, tentative on all sides. I did not press. I let it come at whatever pace it came. As for Karen Whitfield, the civil claim against her for her role in the fraudulent conveyance proceeded. She had retained her own attorneys and contested vigorously, but the court ordered her to return the professional fees Harold had paid her during the period in question, plus damages. a total of $340,000. She was also censured by the Connecticut Real Estate Licensing Board and placed on probation. I was told her consulting practice had lost several major clients after the case became known in professional circles. She had expected to inherit, or at least to benefit substantially from Harold's estate. She received nothing. Harold's will had been drafted before he died. Karen was named, but the will could not supersede the court judgment, which was a senior claim on the estate. By the time the judgment and legal fees and estate costs were settled, the residual estate was modest. Karen hired attorneys to challenge this. She lost. I did not feel satisfaction exactly when I heard this. What I felt was something more neutral, the recognition that outcomes eventually tend to reflect the choices that produce them. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes. And this was one of those times. I bought a small house on a quiet street in Sarasota in the spring of my 78th year. It had a garden, somewhat overgrown, and a screened porch where the evenings were long and the light came through the trees in a way that reminded me, unexpectedly, the first time I noticed it, of the old maple on Birchwood Lane. I planted a tree in the corner of the garden, nothing so ambitious as a maple, a citrus, a Meyer lemon, which blooms in late winter and fills the whole yard with a fragrance that is among the best things I have ever encountered. I sat on my porch on a Tuesday evening in March with a glass of iced tea and a book I had been meaning to read for years, and I thought, this is mine, all of it, the difficulty that produced it and the peace that followed, all mine. That was enough, more than enough. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 76. Age is not weakness. Grief is not the end of strategy. And the people who count on your silence are almost always undone by your voice. I am not a remarkable woman. I am a woman who decided when it mattered most to pay attention. What would you have done in my place? Would you have taken the $800,000 and been done with it? I've wondered. I don't judge the answer. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, subscribe, and thank you, truly, for listening.